lecture in science, and we're using a pair of texts. One of them is Black Holes and Time Warps, and the other one is The Conscious Universe. And we're trying to use this pair of books, as we've used all the way through, to give us a kind of focus. And the focus should be restated again because it is elusive if we're not using it all the time. The focus is not just to frame so as to give us a frame of reference like goalposts, but the focus is to denote for us an interval, a space of measurement, which can be any particular number. It's an algebraic quality of an interval n, or an interval z, or whichever expression one would like to give. This interval, this focus in time, in timing, as well as in space, as place, has a lot to do with our ability to remember. The ancient memory technique was always, at least in the Latin language, characterized by the phrase loci et foci, locus and focus. And you would find this, for instance, in Cicero. Cicero's writing on the art of memory, and Cicero being one of the greatest orators of the great Silver Age of Latin literature, the greatest lawyer of the ancient world, he was famous because he could quote Roman law points instantaneously from a vast mnemonic reserve, and no one else could match him. And in a small book to a man named Herennius, Ad Herennium, this small book contains the ancient art of memory in its Latin language Roman focus. And the code there was loci et foci, that memory is creating a place within which a focus can take place. And that the human mind is capable of almost indefinitely enlarging the loci, and therefore of having an almost infinite number of foci. That is to say, one can build a kind of a grid so that the locus, the loci, the locuses would be multiple, and within each of the boxes of that grid there would be a focus. Within each of the larger units of the grids there would be a focus, and so on. And one could build this kind of structure up. This structure is all based upon visualization, mental visualization, if you like. It is this whole principle of a mind founded on a geometry of space which is in jeopardy in the 20th century. The development of the mind in nonlinear ways in the 20th century has provoked a direct challenge to this classic mental structure. Now, all of the developments of civilization, religion, law, medicine, politics, literature, psychology, sensibility, rationality, all of this long and increasing list of functions and achievements are brought into jeopardy by the same development. What is peculiar is that this development, while publicly new in the 20th century, was in place quite classically all the time, even in ancient times. And Cicero himself was very knowing of an alternate form of memory. The loci et foci form of memory, that there should be a visualization grid, and that within each compartment of the visualization grid, however fine that grid goes, however coarse or broad it seems, one can then multiply the number of images, which would be focuses. However competent that particular memory is, that memory function, it is all based upon image. It is all based upon representation. It is all based upon a correlation of experience with a presumption about nature. In our terms, it's all based upon a mythological cycle. And when one transcends the mythological horizon of image-based language, of thing-correlated representation, when one transcends that horizon, goes above that particular surface, or, given today's lecture, goes below that particular surface, that mythic horizon turns out to be a surface. And that surface, as we will see, is actually a membrane. When we go below that membrane surface of the mythic horizon, that boundary layer that creates the workability of the mind in terms of correlation of image and representation, of the certainty and validity of a mimetic action, of a designate function which holds and has certainty. When we go below that, the entire world that is formed by that membrane ceases to be functional. And in ancient times, the ability to go within that horizon, to sink below that world, which no longer then is certain, but is only the world of appearance. Why appearance? Because it's visually cued. When one sinks below the world of visual appearance, one enters into a completely new condition. In fact, because it is so completely new, it classically was called conditionlessness. And as Plato points out in Book 10 of the Republic, the first time that one enters into that different world, the world below, or in Plato's case, the world above, representation. Below or above the horizon where representation holds, one is completely baffled. The very first experience that's there instantaneously is bafflement. Not puzzlement at something, but bafflement because one is immersed. And the feeling of bafflement, traditionally, in terms of correspondence, in terms of correlative image, the image that goes with bafflement is chaos. And one has a feeling that one is in chaos. Bafflement pairs up with chaoticness when it is not chaotic at all. It's only a presumption of an old traditional habit. But the new is so completely new that one does not have any way to initially characterize to oneself, other than the carryover of the old bad habit, that this bafflement then projects out a chaos. The true condition of the new is not chaos, but, to be more specific, randomness. Vis-a-vis the old order, the new experience is always random. And Plato in Book 10 of the Republic says that most people who spend their whole life down in a cave, chained to a seat, looking at a wall, and behind them there is this fire tended by who knows what demons. And occasionally other demons walk between the fire and us, chained to our seats, looking at the wall ahead of us. And they carry various shapes, and these shapes are cast shadows against the wall. And we think that those shadows are real. And they are but shadows of cutouts and are far removed, many layers and levels and orders removed from reality. And that only occasionally does someone self-consciously discover that these chains can be broken. You don't have to remain chained. And when these chains are broken, one can then turn around and look behind one. The Greek term for this was metanoia, turning around within one's mind. And see that, in fact, these cut-out shapes correspond with the shadows. And vice versa, the shadows are but shadows of cut-out shapes. And that the fire is a temporary source of secondary appearances. And in no way is that primarily real. And that in fact, one then pieces together the picture that one is in a cave, chained to a seat, looking at a wall of shadows that are cast by cutouts, and that this entire ensemble, this entire stage can be exited, and one can come up out of the cave and for the first time come up to what we would understand as the real world. But being accustomed to a cave, being accustomed only to the light of a fire, being accustomed to seeing shadows, the glare of the sun for the first time is so dazzling, so baffling, that many people flee and think this is an untenable realm. And Plato says they go back to their bench, they drape the now broken chains over their wrists, and they sit there with everyone else, only now they are absolutely disenchanted. And they become the cynics. And the bars along the Agora way in Athens were filled with people complaining at goddamn world. Black holes in the late 20th century have done the very same thing for our basis of reality. The ability for the mind to conceive of a black hole drops below the mythic horizon of classical space and classical place, the loci et foci world, is left behind totally and completely. But the bafflement there was projected out as some kind of chaos, and out of this, especially in the mid-1980s, with James Gleick's famous book, Chaos, everybody suddenly is into chaos theory. Right away, there's a misnomer. Chaos theory. Wait a minute. Did I hear that right? Did you say theory? Yes. Theory, our word theory, comes from the Greek theoria. It means contemplation. It means the mind having an amphitheater of spaceless place or placeless space, because contemplation, if it is limited to any kind of a condition, is not real, and contemplation will have no presence. Contemplation is only present when the mind is infinite, because there is only one foci for the mind, and that is its totality. And its totality is indistinguishable from its only center. However many compartments there are to the brain is capable of many compartmentalizations. It is capable of functioning on a loci et foci memory. The brain will function that way. But the mind transcends, either above or below, that limiting capacity of the brain. And the mind has only one center, and that center is indistinguishable from the total extent of the mind itself. And so that center of the mind, known in Plotinus as the One, the classical wisdom mystery schools always talked about it as the One. In black hole theory, when you come to Stephen Hawking's The Large-Scale Structure of Space and Time, 1973, Cambridge University Press, for the first time one gets the characterization that at the center of a black hole is a singularity. Or we can even erase the article a, not just a singularity, singularity. Because the center of a black hole is so radically unique. It is not a hole. It doesn't represent something else in a loci et foci, mythological, visualized brain, but reverberates to a contemplative mind's complete openness. And only a mind's complete openness, only a mind that can look around the edges of a Latin language pigeonhole egg crate box structure would be able to understand in its own presence the affinity of what a black hole, not representing anything else but presenting itself, really is. And the first mind to ever think of this in the 20th century in terms of astrophysics was Stephen Hawking. Due to a peculiar disease, a nervous syndrome, that slowly consumed his neurological functions so that he could no longer function like other physicists. He could no longer hold a pen and make sketches or make computations. He could no longer speak. And so all of his ability to manipulate in terms of representation fell to pieces. But it happened over a long enough time so that he got used to using his mind as an open amphitheater and made all of his calculations in his mind. And because progressively he had to make all of his calculations in his mind, he began to have a presence of person that exceeded his vast ability to make calculations. He became aware that he was using a part of his mind, the brain, to make calculations, but that contemplatively he was aware of something beyond the edges. And when he was aware in that present state, it's a state of high Dharma mystery, he was able to conceive of the limitations of characterizations about black holes that the best mathematicians of the time, of our time, were unable to go beyond. And we're talking about people on the level of Roger Penrose, who later on, understanding the mysterious elegance of Stephen Hawking's ability to transcend visual limitations, to transcend the kind of numerical conditions that even higher mathematics seem to have, to go into new places that weren't even places yet, new spaces that weren't even spaces yet, to allow for resonances to go into complete openness. Penrose later wrote a book called The Emperor's New Mind, to pay homage to the man. And most of this story is here in Kip Thorne's Black Holes and Time Warps. If you'd like to get a copy, you can get a copy. It's one of your textbooks. In the large-scale structure of space and time, Hawking, for the first time, 1973, on page 308, chapter 9, section 2, 9.2, black holes. It's one of the first times that one finds a mathematical designation of a black hole, and one of the peculiarities that Hawking's became aware of was that the old visualization, mythological horizon of representation was founded upon not only loci et foci, but the loci et foci had a correlative. Perhaps that's not the best word, that's the word T.S. Eliot used to use. It had a corollary, that's the mathematical term. The corollary that goes along with the loci et foci visual limitation of memory is the idea of physical causality. And one of the things that is a no-no in causality is that the effect cannot precede the cause. Whereas distinctly Hawking's realized that a black hole is proof positive that effects precede causes in terms of developing singularity. That when a star, a massive star, is gravitationally collapsing, and collapsing beyond a limit where it would just remain a neutron star, collapsing further into a black hole, the center of that collapse becomes a black hole before the surface shows it. And literally, the singularity expands to meet the collapsing surface so that the effect and the cause work together in a complementarity, and that reality on its most deepest fundamental, the real bottom line, not the bottom line on the sheet of paper, but the bottom line below the sheet of paper and the desk on which the sheet of paper is, and the room in which the desk is, and the house in which the room is, and the planet in which the house, and the universe, that below all of that, the real bottom line is that reality is very mysterious. That cause and effect do not happen in sequence, but rush to meet each other. Where have we seen this before on this planet? We have seen this in some of the more abstruse sermons of the Buddha. The Buddha was such a great contemplative. His theoretical capacity was like Stephen Hawking's. He got to the point on his own testimony where he got complete enough in the presence of his wholeness that he no longer had hands with which to accept rice given, and there was no one there giving the rice, and there was no rice giving, and there was no eating function. Nothing worked in terms of the old cause and effects, mythologically bound horizon of representation. How did he survive? He just simply ate. Though it was logically impossible to figure out how it would happen, it still just happened. And out of this comes the very first lesson in enlightenment, and that is, if compassion is not equibalancing with wisdom, you will degenerate into infinite cynicism instantly. Which is why the symptom of suicide is a symptom of just beginning to become aware of the true paradox of reality. And all the negativity that there is in the universe comes out of this realistic trigger. And it isn't a question of not going ahead with wisdom. It's simply that if you don't go ahead with wisdom, you will end up worse off than you were. It's not that a little bit of learning is a dangerous thing. A little bit of learning is a slow poison. Which is why traditional, mythologically bound together human groups forbade, on penalty of death, of anyone having wisdom teaching it publicly. And that the stability of human groups all through time is based upon not having wisdom available to those who are unprepared for it. The only people who ever became shaman were not weekend yuppies going to some kind of conference in the Amazon with Don Eduardo up some river. We're going to go back to our investment portfolio next week. The only people who became shaman were young people who were catastrophically, psychotically injured and could no longer go on. They were sick in such a way that they were going to die, and so they were left to die. And those who survived became the shaman. The worst thing in the world is the shamanic experience. Why? Because it turns you inside out. The Paleolithic classic, in Paleolithic times, the image of a shaman was someone who wore their skeleton on the outside. They were turned inside out. There's no way you can function in the normal world. You forever had to live apart. How far apart? Not feet apart, but whole orders of inside out apart. Paying several $1,000s to go with Don Eduardo to the Amazon for a weekend shamanic experience is height of stupidity. In Italian, stupido. Comprendo? Only someone who is completely baffled would even offer such a thing. Worst thing in the world. All mystery schools were forms of this, and the development of a technique by which you could turn yourself inside out with a succession of interval changed the shamanic experience to what we call the yogic experience. The shaman is someone who screams. The yogi is someone who hums the synthesizing note. And so the whole kit and caboodle, notice the old-fashioned term, the whole kit and caboodle of all the shaman, session, wiseacre, yuppie people. I say yuppie not to characterize the seekers as only yuppies, but believe me, tribes people will never do this. They're staying away from Don Eduardo. Muy malo. The person who made this popular was Mircea Eliade. His book on shamanism appeared in 1949 in Paris, and following up that book on shamanism immediately was a book on yoga. And anyone who reads Eliade's book on shamanism and doesn't read the book on yoga misses the point. Those books are a pair. They go together. If they don't go together, you're in trouble. The difference between a yoga and a shamanic experience is that the yoga has an interval quality. This education is a yoga. It has an interval quality to it. The first thing that a composer will tell a conductor and tell the musicians, he will give the tempo, the cadence, the intervaling of the musical composition. You cannot play something in 3/4 time when it has a different tempo. A rondo in 6/8 time is quite different. You cannot misplay it in a different time frame. This particular education works because the intervaling is maintained with yoga-like exactness all the way through to openness. And it doesn't start from some place. It starts wherever you are when you start. And that singularity is allowed to mature its presence. But one gives ground to the maturing of the presence of the singularity in a measured way, not measured in terms of some kind of measurement. That's a loci et foci condition, which is very severely limiting when it comes to transformation. But in an interval musical scale. What is the large scale? What is the large scale structure of space-time? That reality is mysterious because it includes a complementarity where cause and effect seek each other out. The Buddha, in his deepest meditations and expressing them, it's called in classical Buddhism the Abhidhamma. Not just the Dhamma, which is the Dharma, not just truth, but the above truth, the beyond truth, the within. That Abhidhamma is that always there is this meeting together, that cause and effect seek each other out, that events occur not because of causality, but because of a meeting together. So that events always have this pristine quality of thusness. And that's how the word in Buddhism, the word for it is tathata, suchness. It has a particular taste. It's not a taste of a bitter or a sweet or a sour, but it's a taste of presence. And once one acquires the recognition, the recognition of tathata, of suchness, whenever it is possible for it to occur, one can recognize that. But its occurrence is never in terms of the limiting horizon of mythological conditions. Never. It is always below that or above that. It's always transcendent or immanent from that. So one of the characterizations later on is in the Vajrayana, in the diamond vehicle, is always that the wheel is something one has to get off. The habitual wheel of endless life and death, of karma, one has to get off. What do you have to get off? You have to get off the rim. You will be crushed by the rim of the wheel. If you stay on the wheel, on the rim, as it goes around, there'll come a time when you get crushed. How do you get off a wheel? There are only two ways to get off a wheel. The imminent way is to go to the center. Because no matter how big the wheel, no matter how fast the wheel is spinning, the center of the hub is motionless. And you can exit out the axle space. Or, if you can let go completely enough, you can go off the rim. In the Vajrayana, it's called Lam Rim. No pun intended. It means a meditational technique that has no saddle. It means bareback riding. It's very difficult to do. But anyone, that's the shamanic way. That's like the abrupt, completely letting go of all contact with what you thought was real. That's very tough to do. It's an insane thing. Magic theater for madmen only, Hermann Hesse said. But almost anyone can, in a measured way, come in that yogic path down to the center, to the hub, and can exit out to the quiet, effortless axle. It doesn't make any difference at all. In a very peculiar way, the developments of 20th century physics are paralleled by this kind of two-pronged approach. And the parallel is from some experiments called the Michelson-Morley experiments with light. Splitting a beam of light so that one of the beams goes straight and the other goes perpendicular to it. And if there were any way for the speed of light to be affected by the motion of the Earth, the motion of the star system, whatever, there would be a noticeable difference between the light going perpendicular and the light going straight ahead. No difference was found. And so the speed of light was found to be constant, and Einstein used that constant then as a tether line around which to group mathematical expressions that led to the theory of relativity. Notice here that a tether, a line, is useful as a beginning, but very soon one relinquishes the limitations of the tether. Let me give you the source of the metaphor. When you're taming a wild horse, you use a single line on that horse. That's called the tether. And you fix one end of that rope onto, used to be a stake. And you let the horse go any which way it will, random motion. After a while, because the horse is a unity, it will factor in the limitation of the tether line into its random motion, and that single tether line will introduce a foundation of response, which is a yoga, which in terms of horse and person is the ability then for the person to ride that horse in terms of the organization of the tether. And the tether is transformed into the rein. And that's how you ride a horse. Because a tether can be transformed into a rein. And however the direction of the rein goes, the horse will respond to it, not in some part of its little horse brain, but the wholeness of the horse responds to it. Because the wholeness of the horse learned and factored in the tether. And the transformation of the tether to the rein includes the rider. The rider and the rein go together onto the horse. You don't need a saddle. And the horse factors in whatever rider and this rein, they're a unity. And the response is on the basis of the tether taming. That's how the whole metaphor comes. And it's very, very, very useful. The mind is a random infinity. The tether that's used for this is whatever yogic succession you use. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter what the intervals are. They can be anything as long as they're consistent. You can do this course once a week. You can do it once a day. If you want to hot rod it, you can do it once every 2 hours, but I wouldn't recommend it. You get flipped off the wheel pretty fast that way. I had a hotshot from Brisbane, Australia, who crammed this course into 1 month of listening solid. Never heard from him since. No one's heard from him since. He's probably staring at the Great Barrier Reef, right? And wondering. Why? Because without the interval, you don't have enough heart energy for compassion to develop along with the wisdom. And when you have wisdom, when you have prajna without karuna, without compassion, there's no substrate whatsoever. Prajna by itself is completely wild, random openness. Has no tether, never will. You not only don't know where you are, you don't know that there is someone who doesn't know where you are. It's that radical. So that the heart energy, the compassion, gives a substrate which allows the radical wild openness of wisdom to become a yoga. and therefore wholeness occurs. In a way, the yogic master, the Buddha without compassion, is a black hole person turned inside out. Let's take a break. Yeah. This is the most ancient form of prayer. In Paleolithic times, man prayed like this and opened the hands just slightly. French philosophers and sociologists were the ones who investigated this, and it's called the Orans position. It is not a plaintive gesture, but it's an openness to receive. The most ancient form of prayer was to create a space where God's blessings could be posited. You didn't ask for something. You didn't ask for things. To ask for thingness was a sign of stupidity, of being baffled by the world, whereas spiritual clarity was to create a space to receive whatever God would give. And what does God give? God gives presents. Not presents like Christmas presents, but presents. Presence of the divine. And all the way through, even into Roman Christian ritual habituation times, the effective quality of a Mass, the ceremony of the Mass, is the epiclesis, the receiving of the Spirit in the space made. And without the epiclesis, there's no transformation. And there's no ability then to give communion. The communion is not a resonance of the bread and the wine. It's a resonance of the epiclesis. It's a resonance of space, but not a formed space so much as an open space. In a very peculiar way, a black hole is a formed space whose open resonance are gravity waves. Now, there's a bit of a jump. Talking about Paleolithic man, talking about the Orans position. We end up talking about black holes and religious metaphors. Come in. Zoom in. Great. This would be a discontinuity if you were following bit by bit. If you're following what I'm saying bit by bit, the jump to talking about black holes from Paleolithic Orans praying position, praying mudra, is a sign that you're not really with me. Whereas if you're really with me, the flow of the continuity will carry you. You don't have to understand, in terms of conscious recognition, the entire continuity, the entire flow. All you need to do is to note that there is a carrier wave, which is trustworthy, that's ongoing, and that the continuity exists, and that you can come back later and tune in and get on that carrier wave, and you can flow with it. And as long as I maintain that carrier wave intact, you can always come back at any time, at any point in the future, and harmonize with that carrier wave. You could come back 1,000 years from now, and the carrier wave that I maintain is still there. You could have any snippet of any one of these videos, any minute, say, and you could ascertain from that that there is a continuous carrier wave that's going on there. Well, that's a part of the yoga. No big thing in terms of 1,000 years from now, but big thing now because it's very difficult to do, because it requires riding bareback on completely open mind. The rein that's being put into your hands is the rein of the tether and not the acrobatic bareback riding. But the tether is your relationship to the education. The continuity of your participation in it is your tether. And all I can guarantee is that if you maintain your continuity as much as you can, that tether will hold and will tame. What will it tame? It will tame the threatening randomness of reality, which is your mind in its full presence, in such a way that you can ride. You can go wherever you want to go. But that this is a yogic rather than a shamanic progression. That it has an intervaling, which is important to maintain. And once you get the feel of the signature of the interval, it should hold its consistency all the way through, from Nature 1 to the interval 8 after Science 12. Should hold all the way through. I'm humming a frequency which I maintained for 2 years. And that humming is in terms of the speaking voice. It's a magic voice. Not so much in its abracadabra vocabulary, or in its soothing timbre, or in its resonant or not so resonant Hollywood-style punning or joking around, or its seriousness, but in the experience of its singularity. As Krishnamurti will be heard to say, the speaker is really here, always. And so that continuity maintains itself. And were there no conditions whatsoever in the universe, it would follow a seamless straight line. But because there are conditions in the universe, the straight line undulates and creates a vibration in knowing response to conditionalities. So in the manifest universe, there are frequencies, whereas in heaven, there's only an open, infinite vector. Now, in this particular conditioned universe, whenever anyone has a beginning and an ending, a beginning point and an ending point, they're connected by a line. If you have just a single point, like a pebble in a pond, you will have ripples. It'll be a singularity to that extent. When you have 2 points, a beginning and an ending, then you can have a line. A line has nothing to do with infinity or with straightness, so much as it connects 2 points shortest possible distance. So a line is always measurable. It's always a part of a visualized functional capacity. A line between A and B, or a line between A and A prime. That's a line. Now, if we have 3 points, if we have 3 locuses, we then have a succession which is different. A succession is different from a resonance. It's different from a line. With a resonance, you can have harmony. With a line, you can have geometry. With a succession, you can have mysterious drama. An education is able to take the harmonic resonance of reality and braid it with the geometry of circumstance and allow it to be worn as clothing or costume in the succession that is mysterious. Now, mysteriously dramatic. Now, most educations that are extant now are fundamentally and basically ignorant of this scale, of this dimension. And it's not just a criticism against an education or an educational philosophy or the educations, but it is a pointing out of a structural flaw and deficiency in the entire mind that is conditioned by very large historical circumstance and self-deluding mental aberration. In a way, our civilization doesn't work, not because it doesn't work any longer, but it never did work. That the developments that occurred despite it. And because its non-workability is now so permeable through all ranges and layers, that the despite area is shrunk. So it's not that civilization doesn't work anymore, it just never did work. Because its basis was insufficient for its functional operation. What is a sufficient basis? That there should be an energized form operable enough to be able to present, not to represent, but to recognizably present, to present in recognition a new formation or a transformation of an old order that has become mixed up. And a chaos is an old order that has degenerated, and rather than a chaos being random, a chaos actually is an old order mixed up. If we look at the movement of randomness, true randomness always has a recognizable characteristic pattern to it. The pattern of the paired or so-called double attractors, the butterfly effect, the infinity sign. That in true reality, randomness participates in a substrate of unity on level of singularity. Randomness is deep enough below the horizon of image-conditioned appearance to be, I can't use the term virtual anymore because it's escaped into the vocabulary of appearance. So I have to use the term absolute, which is the term Stephen Hawking would use for the singularity of the black hole. It's an absolute focus rather than a virtual focus. The virtual focus would be still in apparency rather than in actuality. One of the curious qualities of reality is that in the differential mode, forms are very frequently asymmetrical. Differential forms being antisymmetrical or asymmetrical. Asymmetrical is better vocabulary, although Kip Thorne uses the term antisymmetrical. Asymmetrical is better. Differential forms being frequently asymmetrical, this is expressed in a universal idea about energy, the reality of energy, and that is that energy dissipates. That forms which hold energy tend to relax and dissipate, and this is the idea of entropy. Entropy. That if you have a brick of tempered carbon steel, size of a regular brick only out of tempered carbon steel, and you just leave it in the universe long enough, it will crumble. It may take an ungodly long time, but God will, in an ungodly way, crumble all by itself because the internal structure of the form dissipates over time. This is entropy. Without entropy, there would be no effective meeting. There would be no action which would have efficacy, because there would be no way in which energy could be transformed from a given form to some other form. There would be no way for it to pass. There would be no lines connecting anything, and there would be no geometry possible, and the universe simply wouldn't function. So that entropy, the running down of energy forms, is universal principle, universal law, if you like. Not law in terms of law book, but dharma, an actuality. It can be counted upon. In fact, entropy is a good tether for the material universe. The material universe, with the tether of entropy, always tames itself vis-a-vis that. And part of the astuteness of being a spiritual being in a physical body is to understand how to take that tether of entropy and transform it into the reign of something which we have to find a name for. And the name that suggested itself about 30-some odd years ago by a Frenchman. Seems like some of those profound words always come from great Frenchmen who understand these things. And the Frenchman's name was Oliver Costa de Beauregard. And he is cited. I don't have a copy of de Beauregard's book, which appeared in Paris in 1963, the second principle in the science of time. I can't pronounce the French title sufficiently well to avoid embarrassment. But it's quoted in this work entitled Aurora Consurgens by Marie-Louise von France. And this is part of the works of Carl Jung in the Bollingen series. Originally a part of 3-volume work having to do with the aeon, having to do with the structure of the psyche, and that work found in 1956 a culmination in the development, the career, and the life, and the writings of Carl Jung. And the book that appeared then was Mysterium Conjunctionis. And the German original, it came out in 3 volumes. The 3rd volume was Aurora Consurgens. But when it came time to publish the translation into English, it was decided not to put it in the collected works for various lobbying reasons, which I don't wish to go into here. But it was thought to be more discreet to put it in a different color binding, red as opposed to black, and not in the collected works of Carl Jung, but by itself, and then to allow it to go out of print. And in the foreword to Aurora Consurgens, let's see, the title, Aurora is the alchemical term for dawn. The aurora, the rosy glow of the beginning of realization. Why the aurora? Because the aurora is in alchemy it's called the tincture. It's the tincture of red. It's the beginning of the transformation. Now, the true beginning of the transformation is not the aurora. It's not the rose. It's not the rosette. The true beginning is the blackening. The true beginning of a transformation is always, the alchemical term was the negrito, the black wholeness, the negating. As soon as the world horizon of mythological appearance begins to have a blackening, a black spot, that's the beginning of its dissembling. But its dissembling is only dissembling in terms of someone who's staying on the surface of it. Someone who goes below the surface sees that it's not a dissembling, but it's a transformation of it. Or if you rise above it. An observer that goes within, deep within, or an observer who transcends far without, sees the negrito not as the beginning of a decay, but as the beginning of a transformation. But because it's like a black hole, because it's dark in the sense of not black, but because it's not there. The not there, the not visible, the not recognizable quality of it, the notness of it, is never apparent, because notness has no apparency. So ironically, paradoxically, the beginning of a new world is the notness, the beginning of notness. It's like you play a tape of any one of these lectures for some friend, they won't hear it. Why? Not because the speaker can't speak language well, but because the speaker can speak language well. Not speaking in terms of conditioned mythological expectation at all. Not in vocabulary, not in syntax, not in grammar, not in presence whatsoever. Completely and radically different realm. More dimensions than the surface could hold. More than 4 dimensions. And so the initial contact with that occurs to someone who is on the surface, who lives within the world of appearances very comfortably. Is that this doesn't make sense. Don't hear a thing. because cannot make pictures. No picture, no sense. Whereas the true paradox is that's the beginning of wisdom. Is that for the first time maybe in your whole life, someone's talking to you directly without the conditioned language, and you come into contact with no image mind, or known in T.T. Suzuki's great translations of the Zen classics, no mind. First contact with no mind. No image. I think the most beautiful expression of it that I ever heard, one of the early tapes of Chogyam Trungpa, when he was still vibrantly irreverent and before he got into Western ways. He talked about his first enlightenment experience with his root guru, Jamgon Kongtrul of Sechin. And the great Jamgon Kongtrul, really some Dharma force, used to have the young 6, 7, 8-year-old Chogyam Trungpa in Chamdo in far eastern Tibet province come up to his hut, which was way away from the rest of the places where the other monks and even the abbot would hang out. Come up to his hut. It was just a sparse wood frame hut with wood floor and little chinks in the wood because there was no light in there. And the young 8-year-old Chogyam Trungpa used to sit in there with his root guru, with the old man. And he would start every session and ask him how he was. Do you like meditation? Do you like what you're doing? And young Chogyam Trungpa said that when he was with him, when he was with his root guru, there was no way to tell whether this was good or bad or whatever, because there was nothing palpable. And so when he would leave, going back down at the end of the session, he would always wonder because his parting words of his root guru were, now don't tell anyone what we have talked about here. And he said that he would walk back down wondering what not to tell. First contact with true wisdom left no impression of any kind, no druthers whatsoever. Was like fresh air and pure water. You missed it because it was exactly what it was. And you were used to indexing by faults, by taints, by conditions, and this was conditionless. It's like conditionless love. Only knowable in recognition. When you are able to give conditionless love, then you recognize that someone had given you conditionless love, and you didn't know it because it was conditionless, no conditions whatsoever. God's love is conditionless. Not only no strings, no stage, no puppet, no script, nada. Simply singularity. God's love, singularity. Only when we ourselves give that do we recognize that we've had that all the time. Never was interrupted, never was stinted, always pristinely present. What happens then to all of the machinations of defense against insecurity is that they become useless. One can see around the edges far enough to see not only did they not work, that there was nothing really for them to work against, and so that the whole charade was really a waste of energy. Was function of negentropy on psychic level. Less than tempest in a teapot. And that relinquishing of the revenge, of the fear, of the hate, and all of that allows for singularity of God's love conditionlessly to be. Now it's interesting because black holes in astrophysics have brought in response ahead of time large-scale structure of space-time where black holes really characterize for the first time, not in terms of limited event horizon of people like Roger Penrose, but of Stephen Hawking's penetration to real singularity. 1973, Costa de Beauregard's book 1963, 10 years ahead of time, talking about negentropy. Let's get to entropy for a minute, and then we can talk about negentropy and why this is such a fascinating, scintillating idea. Why would Jung in Aurora Consurgens, Aurora being the rosy tint, the beginning of the dawn, Consurgens coming together, the rose coming together. Where does the rosy aura, where does the aurora come together? It comes together in the sun. To paraphrase in a way, John Donne, nothing is more certain in this life than the sun rising. Nothing is more certain in a completely true contemplation than God rising. There is no mistake whatsoever. Because first indication is that entire universe is illuminated by glory of an aurora, of someone rising. Not rising up from hidden, but rising into allness, because perception large enough now to see all, and one comes awake to the allness. Missed it because one was looking for something less, and when you stop looking for half images, graven images, God is there. Or as Nietzsche says, when the half gods go, then God is there. The epiclesis occurs not because he just arrived now, but because you just made the space now. And the space doesn't receive something limited, but it is like a tuning fork. It tunes in the entirety of wholeness. Nothing was put in here. The priests are wrong. God's presence doesn't come into the ritual. God's presence is only universal harmony detected by the tuning fork of our doingness. And by pasting hope onto the ritual, one misunderstands. Why? Because one is still in mythologically limited conditioned horizon. Not just these priests or those priests, all. The whole kit and caboodle. The whole shebang. So that traditional Buddha said, don't hold with ceremonies. Jesus said, don't be taken up by superstitions. You don't need to do this, that, and the other to make this happen, because spirit is not causality whatsoever. Your soul is rushing to meet you, and if you're looking for something, you're not going to meet it. You just keep rushing, but the expectation is cast ahead of you, so you're rushing after something that you're throwing ahead of you. That's truly neurotic. You're trying to catch something that you're throwing out ahead of you, and as fast as you run, you throw it that fast. It's like the Stephen Crane poem that we quoted several times. The great Civil War American writer wrote The Red Badge of Courage, and beautiful short stories, The Blue Motel, A Hotel, The Open Boat. He wrote a poem. It went something like this. I saw a man pursuing the horizon. Round and round he sped. It is futile, I cried, accosting the man. You can never, you lie, he cried, and ran on. Someone in that condition, and we are all in that condition, never can be. We are mummified in the expectation that our becomingness is going to work. And so we feed it more and more intensity because that's going to make it work. Or we feed it less and less intensity because that's going to be graceful and that's going to work. Or when the whole operative trigger is not to feed it at all. No food of any condition. It doesn't need any safety. It doesn't need any security. It doesn't need any threats. It doesn't need any promises. And when we talk this way, it's boring. Why? Because it's only talk, and right away our spirit flees. Spirit is like the quality of romance. Detecting a line goes elsewhere. So the traditional wisdom never talked about it in any direct way or even in circumventual way, but created openness, not to receive it so much, but to tune us to the real. Black holes tune us to the real. Not the idea of black holes, but the phenomena of black holes tune us to the real. And part of the real is that they are only black holes because negentropy works even vis-a-vis black holes. We talked about a line. We talked about how other than the two-ness of a line, there's the oneness of singularity, there's the three-ness of succession. Or succession. We better not succession. That's dropping out in a big way. Succession. Let's formulate then for just a second. Let's go back to old-fashioned loci et foci pictures. There's one, there's two, there's three, and if we have that range, then the rest of the range of possibility, no matter how vast it is unbounded. So that the title of one of the best books of the 20th century is 1, 2, 3, Infinity, George Gamow. 1, 2, 3, infinity. Because if you can count to 3 accurately, if you can do A, B, C accurately, then the entire alphabet of creation is available. The entire vocabulary is available. Why is that so? Because the space of pictoriality is essentially a 3-quality, a 3-dimension. You can have a linear pictoriality on 2 dimensions. But the most convincing of all pictoriality is three-dimensional space, or what we call space. If you go beyond a three-dimensional space, if you go to 4 dimensions, it doesn't increase space. Space doesn't get an added dimension, but it becomes temporality dynamic. Time becomes space-time. If you go to 1 dimension, you lose pictoriality. If you have a single pixel, or a pixel as a singularity, there's no image. The 1 does not record as an image, though it is there. The 2 and the 3 record as images, and you can have them moving images, although it doesn't modify space at all, simply adds time to it. But when you go beyond that 4-dimensional space-time, again, you go off the graph where pictures can form. It's just like the electromagnetic spectrum, and visible light is only so many angstroms, and that's it. If you go below that, you get into something like ultraviolet blue and into X-rays. If you go beyond it the other way, you get into infrared, and eventually you get into radio waves. You cannot see radio waves, but they exist. You cannot see X-rays, but they exist. Radio waves about the length of a football field. X-rays really hardly blips that are there. But visible light only a certain frequency. The same for mental pictoriality. Mental pictoriality, images, only occur on a mythological horizon of language in the mind at certain frequency, and when someone speaks with deep vibrato that has longer or shorter waves, there's no image that forms in the mind at all. Not because nothing has been said, but because what has been said is deeper or of higher frequency than ordinarily one would hear. To be limited to mental pictoriality means that you are conditioned to voices, to language, which is severely crimped. And just because you may not run into someone who can speak on X-ray or in radio wave levels doesn't mean that it's not real, just means it's very rare. Maybe 1 in 100 million. Maybe 1 in a billion, who knows? Nevertheless, it's like in Chuangzi. All the little thrushes hopping around on a bush discuss this rumor about a huge bird that, flapping its wings once, soars 100,000 miles. And the little birds all agree this couldn't possibly be real. Because no matter how any of us beat our wings, most we can do is go from one twig to another. And that's what birds do. We go from one twig to another. How could there be a bird called francolin flaps its wings once and goes 100,000 miles? And then Chuangzi, being real good mystic, next line translates as, I am like a bird who, having gone south long enough, now goes north. This is freedom. The freedom is not in terms of choices within the conditionality. Has nothing to do with that. Those choices are bogus shopping lists. None of the above, not even the list. But to surgically remove oneself from that in high-powered, daring way, you have to wear your skeleton outside. Whereas in measured interval way, education is the way. Now, aurora consurgens, the rosy consurgens, the coming together into the sun, has in its foreword to the English edition Oliver Costa de Beauregard's idea that complementing negentropy, the running down of the physical universe by entropy, is this negentropy, the rising of spiritual form in the non-visible universe. The visible universe is based upon a geometricity of sight, on a visibility, on a mental pictoriality having to do with space. All of Descartes' geometry has to do with that kind of space. The non-Cartesian, non-geometricity is a non-linearity. And non-linearity is the structure by which a black hole remains real. The tapes are out, but we can put it here to you. From Kip Thorne. A quantity is called linear if its total size is the sum of its parts. Otherwise, it is non-linear. A quiescent black hole owes its existence to gravitational nonlinearity. Without the gravitational nonlinearity, the whole would not hold itself together. The whole's space-time curvature continuously regenerates itself non-linearly. The self-generated curvature acts as a non-linear glue to bind itself together. It's very sublime. This kind of language was used about 1,500 years ago by a man who had no name. The name he took was a mythological name for initial identification purposes, which one could dismiss later. The mythological name he took was Dionysius the Areopagite. He lived about 500 AD. And he wrote a beautiful series of short little books. One of them is called The Mystic Theology, in which he saw in the vastness of his contemplative mind an infinite darkness, so infinite that after he got used to being in an infinite darkness, suddenly blinking into visuality were whirling spirals of angelic beings. This is a mental, pictureless, contemplative vision of intergalactic space done about 1,500 years ago. His description matches perfectly the photographs we have in astrophysical books of the late 20th century. How can a human being do this? Because at a certain juncture of excellence and transformation, the mind open to its reality is able to encompass reality. Another example is in the discovered notebooks of Roger Bacon, who was jailed in prison by his religious confreres for many, many decades. And like Leonardo da Vinci, he wrote upside down and backwards, so no one could very well read his work. And in the margins of his notebooks, he drew very clear diagrams of spermatozoa and ovulatory eggs in perfect detail, which any biological text now will show. How could Roger Bacon 800 years ago see those clearly in his mind? with accurate microscopical detail, because the spiritual mind can resolve the conditions of conditionedness to any specification whatsoever, because one has the screen of the real against which to put the differentiation. This is why the good news, really superior contemplative spirit, already assures us, don't worry, it's already handled in the best way it can be, and you're already as safe as you can possibly be. You're already home. Your only work is to learn how to accept